For over 250 years, the United States has relied on an incredibly complex federal machine. But, this architecture of liberty wasn't just built overnight. Welcome to the special Anniversary Explainer, where we're going to take a deep dive into the fascinating evolution of American power. We're going to see exactly how this machine adapted to a rapidly growing and honestly often deeply divided nation.
It really brings up a massive historical question. How in the world did a loose, incredibly fragile alliance of independent states transform into the architecture of a global superpower? Well, to find out, we have to look closely at these structural crises that define the country, from the early republic, through the messy frontier wars, and right up into the dawn of the Cold War.
So let's get into it. Part 1. Forging the federal machine in the early republic.
Okay, flashback to the thunderstorm at Philadelphia on July 4, 1776. After declaring independence and following the glaring failures of the Articles of Confederation, the new nation faced a huge structural crisis at the 1787 Philadelphia Convention. How do you balance a functioning national government with fiercely independent states? This ideological divide was perfectly captured by two key figures from the original Committee of Five. On one side, you had Thomas Jefferson advocating for a small government approach, really prioritizing state autonomy. But on the other side, John Adams was pushing hard as a staunch defender of a strong, centralized machine. It was a fundamental battle over who actually holds the power.
To prevent these independent states from essentially flying out of their proper orbits, the framers needed a solution. Enter the Madisonian Compromise. Instead of giving Congress a direct veto over state laws, Article 3 of the Constitution allowed Congress to institute inferior federal courts. This birthed the whole concept of concurrent jurisdiction. Basically, it allowed both state and federal courts to operate side by side, creating a judicial buffer to mediate power between the nation and the states.
And people at the time absolutely knew this was a massive experiment. In 1791, one citizen described these courts as a highly experimental new wheel in the federal machine. This was not just some boring legal technicality. This transition from total state sovereignty to federal jurisdiction, cemented by the Judiciary Act of 1789, was the primary tool used to carve up power between the states and the federal government.
Which brings us to Part 2, the Revolution of 1800, the first great test.
This fragile new machine was almost completely destroyed by the election of 1800. It was the very first real transfer of national political power, and it completely deadlocked in the House of Representatives. Just look at this timeline. Over 5 incredibly tense days, the House conducted 35 deadlocked votes. Real threats of insurrection were breaking out everywhere. Rumors of coups and assassinations were spreading like wildfire. Finally, on the 36th vote, a compromise allowed Jefferson to win. The peaceful transfer of power survived, sure, but man, just barely.
But the outgoing Federalists, aligned with Adams, were not about to just pack up and leave quietly. Right before losing power, they passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. This was a vast expansion of federal power that gave courts broad arising under jurisdiction. They literally weaponized the legal system to entrench their political power on their way out the door before the Jeffersonians naturally repealed it a year later.
Moving on to Part 3, Frontier Wars and Executive Power. The machine expands.
As the nation grew, the machine's logistics just totally collapsed during the War of 1812. The federal government fundamentally failed to supply its militias. This led to absolute logistical nightmares against the Creeks in 1813, and it culminated in a swift British force actually burning Washington to the ground in 1814. The system was visibly failing under the pressure. And this vacuum of federal competence set the stage for some highly dramatic moments on the frontier. Picture this. It's January 1st, 1815, at the Battle of New Orleans. A dense morning fog finally clears, and British artillery unleashes a devastating bombardment on the American line. They are deliberately targeting the McCarty House. Inside, General Andrew Jackson and his staff are literally eating breakfast. They narrowly escape the building right before it's reduced to a smoking shell. It was pure chaos, but it cemented America's reliance on strong, fiercely independent field commanders to get the job done.
And this executive military strength just continued to expand. A few years later, Andrew Jackson essentially invaded Spanish Florida without explicit congressional approval. But Secretary of State John Quincy Adams defended the action in 1818. He argued that if Spain failed to control its own border, well, the U.S. had the right to self-help. He masterfully shifted the blame onto the Spanish officers, providing a legal justification that vastly expanded the scope of executive war-making power without Congress.
All right, Part 4, World War II Survival, a Global Crucible.
Leaping forward to the mid-20th century, the federal machine faced a totally new existential threat. To grasp the sheer scale of World War II, just consider this single event in 1942. Japanese dive bombers strike the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. One bomb hits directly in the stack, completely snuffing out the boilers and plunging the crippled ship into total darkness and chaos. We aren't talking about a frontier skirmish anymore. This was a desperate, fully mechanized fight for survival on a global scale.
Which launches us into Part 5, the Cold War Blueprint, Bipolar Power. Surviving that WW2 crucible fundamentally changed everything, throwing the United States headfirst into a bipolar world order against the Soviet Union. To navigate this dangerous new reality, the government desperately needed a grand strategy. Enter National Security Report 68, or NSC 68. Spearheaded by Paul Nitze in 1950, it meticulously analyzed Soviet intentions and served as the definitive blueprint for American containment policy.
NSC 68 presented President Truman with a stark, terrifying reality. Continuing current policies was deemed way too weak. Isolation meant basically handing all of Eurasia over to the Soviets, and preemptive atomic war, way too risky. So the architects argued there was only one viable path forward, a massive, incredibly rapid buildup of political, economic, and military strength to shield the free world.
The results of that decision were immediate and, honestly, staggering. Look at this number. By 1951, just a single year after NSC 68 was adopted, total U.S. military personnel had doubled to over 3.2 million troops. The machine was expanding its manpower at a rate never seen before in American history.
Financially, the reality was just as extreme. In a single year, the military budget skyrocketed from $13.5 billion to $48 billion. That massive influx of cash funded a massive conventional buildup in Europe and aggressive thermonuclear research, all to make sure the U.S. stayed a step ahead of the USSR.
But this new power wasn't just kept at home, it was heavily projected outward. The Mutual Security Act of 1951 began supplying heavy military equipment, we're talking M47 tanks and F-840G jets, to vulnerable non-communist nations. Just pause and notice how far the machine's reach has extended from its original 13 fragile states. The new goal was to build a fortified economic and military shield globally to halt Soviet expansion dead in its tracks.
Ultimately, this global containment strategy pulled America into Vietnam. And you have to see this shocking breakdown of motives from the Pentagon in 1965 regarding the escalation. According to their own internal memos, 70% of the motivation was simply to uphold U.S. credibility and avoid the humiliating defeat. Only 10% was specifically to ensure a free way of life for the South Vietnamese. It perfectly reflects the rigid global mandate of NSC 68 to protect American prestige at absolutely all costs.
Which brings us full circle. The original architects of this very machine, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both providentially died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826. That was exactly the 50th anniversary of the independent nation they built. They left behind an architecture of liberty forged entirely in crisis. From their bitter political battles in the early republic to the global atomic standoff outlined in NSC 68, American power has always evolved to meet existential threats. So as you reflect on this incredible 250-year history, ask yourself, what crisis will shape the federal machine next? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and as always, keep on learning.